I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, introducing the Leader of Opposition to begin the clash.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Amazing. If the debate is about understanding art as fast as possible, then probably OG wins. But that is not what art is about. Art is often about the diversity of experience that we gather, regardless of our background, and being sure to spread messages, whether it is anti-authoritarian, whether that is the diversity of human experience and the beauty of it. I think that is what art is. And I want to be clear on what the burden of opening government is in this debate. Because on our side of the debate, cryptic art is not the only form of art that exists, right? Because often cryptic art coexists with other forms of art, such as lowbrow art, such as films, for example, or such as these other kinds of things. What this means is now the burden on Gov is to prove why should we oppose cryptic art exclusively, even if there are other forms of art that exist now. Because if they want to talk about access, it is unclear why suddenly when you remove cryptic art, there's a huge influx of individuals who are going to consume art. We think on our side of the debate, they will still consume the art, for example, that is accessible for everyone, even if you buy the idea that it's inaccessible. But I want to directly respond to the argument from OG, which is cryptic art really inaccessible in the first place? And there are four lines of response towards this. The first is the very grave assumption that OG makes in this debate. Because the assumption that they make in order to make their argument possible is the assumption that minorities and poor individuals are uneducated, which is why they cannot interpret art. I posit that even in the farthest of areas, there are still things like art classes for you to be able to understand things like art movements and things like the different motifs and how to interpret art in a way that is actually productive towards you. So what that means is, in the advent of education and technology now being as accessible as more than in history, means that it is unclear why this inaccessibility or this lack of education still exists now. But even if you don't buy that analysis, I'm going to proceed to my second line of response, which is I think it is fine because we sidestep the harm that exists from Gov, because the beauty of cryptic art is that it's a little different from everyone. The difference with explicit art is there's a right interpretation when it comes to these certain things. But the beauty with cryptic art is there's no right or wrong answers. That is to say, you can plug in your own lived experience as a minority, for example, as an uneducated, as a poor individual, into interpreting that art and still create something that is meaningfully cathartic towards yours. That is something that's unclear to happen in things like Renaissance art or art that is focused on the technicality of it, versus on our world, it's a little bit something for everyone. But the third line of response is the counterfactual is likely to be worse, because even if you get to understand, right, even if you get to access, for example, explicit art, the extent of that access is only understanding how beautiful it is. That is appreciating its colors, appreciating its technicality, but you don't understand the message and it doesn't reverberate to you at a personal level. Precisely because the key towards understanding explicit art is still the exclusive cultural nuances that exist in a white society. You don't understand how Europeans lived in the Middle Ages, which is why you don't get catharsis, for example, on your world, versus on our world, it's much more accessible because there's no tangible image of what that art is supposed to be. What this does in the OG case is, first, it creates a huge shadow of doubt on whether or not this inaccessibility exists. But there's a missing link on this argument to prove why do people suddenly get more access on their world when they single out, for example, and oppose cryptic art exclusively. Yes, Sam.
So in some sense, this is also very, very inexclusive because you can target and look for specific types of art that can evoke the feelings that you want to feel as a minority. Why does it specifically have to happen through cryptic art insofar as this benefit is non-exclusive?
No, the burden of this debate for side opposition is not to make cryptic art the only form of art, so other forms of art will still exist. So if it's inexclusive, we have an added form of art that increases the quality of the experience, versus on your world, it's more muted. First argument, cryptic art allows for a more widespread and deeper form of experience. And there are four premises to this argument. The first is people who consume art have different context and lived experience. And this is how I co-opt the minority argument from government. Because we have different things like culture. We have different things like our own lived experiences, which make explicit art far more inaccessible versus cryptic art where it's more like, up into interpretation. What this means is art will inherently mean something different for individuals. And often, purely explicit art are marginally more foreign. That is why we don't understand, for example, the cubism of Picasso, not because it's cryptic, but because the school of art that existed was one that is landlocked, for example, towards the European academic, for example, form of art. But second premise of this argument is, I think the beauty of cryptic art is that it diversifies the experience for everyone. And you need to buy this argument precisely because the value of art in the first place is its experience and what it can bring towards people on the ground. So in our world, we have things like death of the author. We have things such as forwarding the lived experiences of individuals and making art timeless and immortal for people in the future generations to actively appreciate these forms of art. What this means is, on our world, there's no right or wrong answer that exists with cryptic art, and which is why it's nice. But next is that it allows people to see their own lived experience in that art, which is why it's exclusively cathartic for them. But also, that means it creates a higher quality of interpretation and understanding, because that is a form of art where they can easily plug in their own lived experience, versus on their world they have to understand and pretend as if they're a white individual, for example, who's trying to understand these other forms of art. But the third is about timelessness. All right, because often the thing with explicit art is that it is often chronocentric. That is to say, these things are a product of their time. They age very quickly. We think that the main difference in a cryptic form of art is that often it is timeless. There are no markers of time, there are no markers of culture, and there are no markers of context. What this means is, even a few thousand years in the future, it will still bring meaning towards people on the ground. It will still make them cathartic, and it's still something that they can inherently appreciate. What then is the impact of this argument? First is that you inherently cater to more individuals because you lower the barrier of interpretation in as much as they only have to bring in their lived experience. The second is that it's more cathartic. So if you don't agree with the idea of access, if for the people who still have access on our world, we think that the level of appreciation that they get of our art is on a deeper level versus on their world is more surface. But the third is that we immortalize the art, and this is more important for things like art preservation, for example, and making this art as culturally valuable in the future. The second is this idea on censorship and authoritarianism. I'm just going to steal the extension. Cryptic art creates strong messages that protect artists, especially in authoritarian states. Precisely because the context of authoritarian states, they censor art, right? You can see this with Iran, for example, with films, or even with Malaysia, right? But the thing with cryptic art is it exclusively allows for the bypass of censorship. Note that not all cryptic art can bypass, but the difference is we have an increased amount of bypassed art that can actually reach people on the ground because of things like subliminal messages, because of things like plausible deniability. What then is the importance of this? The first is that you reach, for example, the messages that these artists want to put forward to society. So if it's feelings of revolution or resistance, that's something that we get more. But more importantly is that we protect these artists from things like censorship and imprisonment and killing. But more importantly, we encourage these artists to actually express how they feel to make them more productive members of society. That is why we oppose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech. Now we conclude the front half debate, introducing the DLO.
Give me a second. The camera is not working. Okay, great. I'll start the speech. I'll pick your voice in 3, 2, 1, go. The first thing I'll do in this speech is talk about the largest frame to which cryptic art usually dominates and tell you why we win first in that context. And later, talk about the other context of the debate where most of this art coexists and why cryptic art also provides another comparative advantage within that context. So the first thing that I'll engage with is the context to which most of this debate is most relevant, is one where art necessarily has to be cryptic. We believe that often these are found in states that often censor explicit art against their regimes. Therefore, this debate is not meaningful in liberal states insofar as these states usually allow various forms of art to exist anyway. There is no meaningful delta in opposing or nor supporting it because the change is often minimal. What matters the most, therefore, are contexts in which cryptic art is the sole way of expression for most artists. We believe that this only happens, again, in regimes that are often authoritarian or have an incentive to, censor. What I demonstrate under this context from them is very important. What we suggest is that the cryptic art is often the only way for artists to sustain, but also survive in making art, insofar as most of the time it is within the consumers that have to interpret the forms of art. So you do not explicitly call out, for example, the regime. You do not explicitly capture the emotions of the people who are oppressed within the society, because it is often within or up to those consumers who does that. So what we say here is that it is good for the artists because they are first protected, but the second is that they're also able to express their emotions, and again, of course, survive within making those art, having money, etc., etc. So you have to care for this context. because it is one where we see the greatest change in the debate, insofar as the delta of the other context is one where most of these arts coexist. Absent cryptic art, you remove any forms of expression for these artists that are trapped within these forms of regime. They cannot meaningfully do their job. They cannot meaningfully express themselves within this standing harm that opening government does not engage with. The second thing I'll do is now talk about the second frame of the debate about like coexistence. The mistake of Gov here is that they implicitly suggest that the privilege will always dictate the kinds of interpretations that people should have, that there is only one correct interpretation of art. I would note that this, in fact, is the harm that exists within the comparative of theirs when the meaning is already explicit, when the meaning of the art is already shown. On our side, they have most of the incentive as the privilege to democratize and often create discussions with people who consume this art precisely because there is no single meaning of that art, precisely because it is cryptic. So even if these minorities have a different meaning, like they say, what the democratization does that comes from the privilege allows more people to discuss for more discussions to exist. So it's easier, for example, to correct probably worse forms of biases, check your assumptions about art, etc., etc. So perhaps it is true that some minorities are not as educated as they suggest. What we say is that most of the time, because of cryptic art, there is an incentive for most of intellectuals to democratize that information. This does not happen when art already has an explicit meaning because it limits the kinds of flexibility that you have as the intellectual to interpret this art. Therefore, that's when you likely subsume these individuals to say that there is only one interpretation of art that exists. So even at the form of minority, we get that better. The next thing I'll talk about is why access is likely to be much better on our side and weigh out the mechanisms to which we prove why access is good. What we say coming from Ben is simple. The art is usually easier to interpret when you lower the barrier of access to interpretation of art because of how cryptic art will coexist with other forms of art. That is to suggest that perhaps you do not know how to interpret the Mona Lisa. It is easier for you to then interpret the cryptic art that like probably is in the another gallery or things like that. We think that this is important because more often than not, the other forms of art that explicitly suggest interpretation is not accessible to people. Let us suggest, for example, Frida Kahlo's broken column requires you to understand who and what Frida Kahlo is and her forms of experiences. And again, is not breach towards like other forms of people. A difference on our side is that for most of these people who consume art out of leisure, out of fun, it is easier to access them precisely because you do not have you need all of this knowledge in order to meaningfully interpret this art. Why is this group of people the most important? We would suggest that often art experts and people who love art will still consume art either way from either side of the debate, precisely because of independent reasons, such as perhaps they just love art, or perhaps it's because of legacy and experiences, etc., etc. However, for most of the people who just do this out of leisure, in the comparative of Gov, it is easier for them to be shunned away, precisely because the forms of art on their side are ones where it requires people to intellectualize, which often is not accessible to many, precisely because of anything that Gov, because of anything like the meaning that's often trapped within behind the intellectualization that exists within Gov. The difference on our side is how we lower that intellectualization and increase the experiential value of art. Their response here is that it is harder to interpret art because the meaning is not explicit, but it is not true. Precisely because it is not explicit, it is easier to substitute your own experience to that interpretation. It is unclear why when you go to a like museum that you prioritize the brush strokes or like the technicality of the art. Like a vibe check here is that when you go to a museum, right, you don't immediately think about, oh wow, really cool brush strokes, really cool oil pastel, but you rather just think about what makes you happy, why this kind of thing is cool for you based on your own experiences, the POI.
So again, if it is true that these things are so esoteric in nature, then how can you meaningfully transfer your experiences when there is little to share in the vast majority of instances, and therefore you have to trade off some viscerality in the emotion you feel when consuming this type of art?
So even if it's not explicit, what we say is that your experience becomes the reference point to which you get that interpretation from. So it is true that perhaps not you will have varying interpretations with other people, but that is not a reason to like oppose the motion insofar as people can make discussions within these own forms of lived experiences. But more than that, there is a point of like coexistence within these forms of experiences when you talk about art. Such as, for example, when you belong within a group of minority, it is easier to have some similar forms of experiences that people can relate to. So that is also why, again, it is only an opening opposition where you can maximize the discussions that is created from art, precisely because you remove because you lower the barrier within that interpretation. How should you position this in this debate? What we show you is how cryptic art changes how the majority consumes most of the art. We think that they are the most important population that should exist within this debate, insofar as most of the time they are the ones that usually frequent in a lot of museums, but they are also the ones that position how art is relevant within the larger scope of society. Most of the time, when people do not feel included or the public does not feel included with how art participates within the world, it is harder to get funding. It is harder to get public perception as to why art is actually meaningful within the world. So what we do then is, because we lower the barrier, it is easier for people to opt in towards art, and therefore you also position art to be something that's more relevant within the overall society. That is something that you should propose for.
I thank I thank the member of government. I thank the deputy leader of opposition for that speech. Now we begin the back half debate, introducing the extension speaker of closing government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Awesome. I'll take POIs through voice. Start in 3, 2, 1. So to start the speech, I want to talk a bit about burdens first. So I don't think opening government gets their burden. And the reason why is because I agree with opening opposition that the list of harms that opening government talks about can be relatively mismanaged and sidestepped when you agree with the premise that there are
Sam, you're very choppy right now.
types of art
Is it just me?
that people can
No, he's
into,
also quite choppy here.
You, yeah.
which
Sam,
is also consequential for me to believe the vast majority of OOs benefit.
hello? Sam?
Hello, hello,
Yeah.
hello.
You were
Hello?
so choppy, I did not hear much of your speech at all.
That's crazy.
Uh,
Sorry.
could you
What ended up happening is that, yeah.
I think you can restart. Is it fine now? I think it's frozen. Okay, maybe the video is the problem. Yeah, the video is frozen. I'm gonna switch off my video at this point.
Video.
I think for just to be safe, we'll keep the video off.
Yeah. Okay. If I cut off at any point in time, just shout. Awesome. I just start from 0, right?
Yes.
Okay. Start in 3, 2, 1. So let's talk about burdens first. I think OG misses their burden because OO correctly points out that a lot of the harms that OG posits as to why cryptic art could be bad can be sidestepped with the observation that other types of art can be opted into by many different people. And therefore, cryptic art necessarily isn't really that important. And therefore, a lot of their harms fall out of this debate. Opening opposition also responds to this claim by themselves because a lot of the benefits, as I already pointed out in my POI, become hard to believe at the point at which you believe that a lot of these things can also be substituted for the types of art that you would likely be able to access on either side of the debate. Whether it be the Spoliarium by Antonio Luna or other forms of representative art that could allow people to feel their feelings, I'd actually flip this and argue that it's far more visceral, which is something that is unique coming from closing government, insofar as if you do believe opening government's premise that many of these people are uneducated, then that means that the ways in which they're able to internalize art likely exist to a far greater extent on the people and the emotion that art allows them to evoke. So it's more directed and more focused under our side. The last thing that's left standing then from opening opposition is an explanation on why this is important in authoritarian regimes, to which I have 3 easy responses. The first is that Oftentimes, all types of art are restricted within regimes, and the reason why is because they want to be safe in the vast majority of instances, and therefore err on the side of caution and just block all types of art out, especially ones that are privy to a lot of different interpretations, such as what happened in martial law. The second is that oftentimes artists also want to err on the side of caution, and therefore just don't create art until they're relatively safe from the confines of the vast majority of these authoritarian states. Like Juan Luna from the Philippines only started creating paintings when he was in Paris and not when he was in the Philippines. And the third is also that a lot of the people that viewed this type of art or the revolutionary art also viewed it post-war. So the actual effect of it within the war is also minimal in comparison to a lot of the things that they could be doing. What is this debate about then, and what is the unique contribution we'll bring you from closing government? We'll explain why this devalues art as a whole, where society takes the entire field as less serious and a joke, and therefore are less willing to do things like pay artists fair wages or even channel the art into something meaningful and therefore value it as a society. And the reason why this is important is because in fulfilling our strategy, which is explaining why OG doesn't feel their burden and why the burden that is set up by opening opposition in explaining why individuals have a right to be able to process it in this way fall flat insofar as we mitigate a lot of their benefits, and therefore we're going to prove the harm now. Then, why do people see it as a joke? And this is the first layer. I want to note that by structure, in order to be open to many different perceptions, as cryptic art needs to be, you must do things like minimize features, make it as esoteric as possible, which is where you get art like banana taped to a canvas or matte black paintings. And in a world where people judge things on the merit of difficulty and skill, seeing something so seemingly simple and basic often has people value it less. I.e., in the vast majority of instances, it's far harder for you as a person to be able to put value to a banana tape to a piece of canvas rather than an intricately created piece of art that allows you and has a very, very clear message. Insofar as the value systems in which humans engage with how they value every single thing in this world are largely built upon merit and the work that you put into the art. And insofar as the art that is created and labeled as cryptic in the vast majority of instances isn't as, time demanding in the vast majority of instances, isn't as intricate, since that is the prerequisite to the vast majority of these things, it's often harder to be able to make that connection on how people value that art. But the second is because of absurdity, i.e., it is so confusing in the vast majority of instances, which is also a prerequisite to any cryptic art, and seemingly useless that people, by affirming it, oftentimes also affirm that a banana taped to a canvas is therefore worth more than what they're earning at any given job, and therefore aren't willing to make that trade-off or aren't willing to make that concession, and therefore just default to valuing it less. The reason why this is important, this is the second layer, is because oftentimes cryptic art is conflated with the other types of art that actually is useful in status quo. And here's where I want to reject the premise that comes from them, right? Because if they say that art like spoliarium, which incites revolutionary tendencies, often lie under cryptic art, that is simply untrue, since it is very direct in what it wants to make you feel in the vast majority of instances. So they have to defend the most esoteric pieces of art that make people confused and therefore not have them feeling anything from the moment, and therefore have to expel more in order to be able to interact with it as such. The reason why they conflate it with normal art, and this is also important because this explains the trend in which, cryptic types of art dominates art discussions, is because often these pieces dominate it because this sort of messaging is parroted again and again, because an average person is more susceptible to outrage than joy. I.e., a person is less likely to share a piece if it's beautiful, as opposed to posts showing banana art pieces going for millions of dollars, labels that are specifically there to incite a sort of feeling within a person and therefore make them harder to be able to believe and therefore share it because they're so mad with the scenario. But importantly, even if there are relatively existent pieces of art regardless, it's specifically the fact that these pieces come in the modern era exclusively and therefore are often localized and sensationalized by the media as the trend of modern art as a whole. So even if they're good artists that talk about classical styles or one that actually demand intricacy, it's the fact that the image of modern art becomes these bananas taped on the wall or matte black paintings. But before I go on, sure, I'll take opening opposition.
So what this extension proves is that cryptic art can be bad, but this is not exclusive to cryptic art only. The burden from CG is still unsolved. Why does it have to be opposed?
No, this doesn't prove why cryptic art is bad just for the sake that it's bad. It's proving why it's bad because it conflates itself with every other type of art within the industry. And therefore, since people view it as bad, it means that the entire perception of the industry goes down. What this extension proves is the prerequisite mechanisms that is prerequisite to OG, because they simply assert that in the vast majority of instances, it's difficult. We explain why the trajectory of it is towards dominating other types of art and the discussions and how people perceive it, which is where you get impacts such as artists being paid less, which is where people are less able to commit themselves and actually understand art because they see it as a joke and therefore not something that ought to be serious. But the second thing to note under this is also attention economy. And here the observation I'd like to make is that oftentimes the people creating cryptic art are often rich white people who often don't have the capability nor the threat of like money and all of those things. That is to say that they have the confidence to be able to create this cryptic art. And insofar as it dominates the economy and the interests of individual people, it's that they take away resources from actually decent art and the ones that are exposed most to children. Ones that actually come from minority communities and talented artists are now being hidden in the shadows and therefore are much less willing or less able to do things like make ends meet because it's dominated by rich white people who create this cryptic art in the first place. We don't support Marcel Duchamp and the stupid shit that he created, which is why we propose. Thanks.
I thank the member of government for that speech. Now to start the closing opposition case, member of opposition.
Hi, PA pronouns. See you guys on chats, please. I think I will take out this one. Starting in 3, 2, 1. As I flagged in my POI to OG, we absolutely agree with OO when they say that cryptic art doesn't have right and wrong. That's why it's inclusive to anyone and any interpretations. But the strategic failure of OO is that it just remains an assertion under OO, and there is no structural reason to prove that it's the cryptic art is structurally likely to be the one that's inclusive to any opinion from any people from any backgrounds, and that is the contribution I'd like to make from member of government. Before moving on to actual extension, one quick clarification and to just say that given the wording of this motion, it's pretty not good to just talk about museums and classic and just painting, but rather we are happy to include things like films that looks like, for example, Matrix, in which there are a lot of interpretation what Neo is fucking doing, or lyrics that are open to interpretation that are seen in the music industry in the status quo. Moving on to that classic vertical extension, why is accessibility better on the word opposition? We think this is a prerequisite for any impact that's as I agreed in the opening half, and it's probably central to most central issue in the debate. That's why I'd like to issue it, address it. I think I agree with O's conclusion, but they haven't analyzed anything about who creates the narrative, who creates art, and how the people perceive the discourse surrounding art, and hence failing to prove that it's one structurally likely to integrate the poor and undereducated people. The first thing I want to analyze is who creates art on our side of the house, because CG points out that it's white privilege that creates cryptic art, which we bitterly disagree. We think unlike the traditional art that, for example, requires 20 years of experience to going to art school, which is quite expensive, those cryptic art don't necessarily require experience, which is often expensive, but rather randomly assigned sense of art, or the ability that's gifted by God. That is why it's extremely unlikely that only white privilege are going to dominate that creation of art art on our side of the house. That's likely to be the case rather on the government side of the house. That is why like the people who are like drawing like art and like uploading on social media are already buzzing, even if they're like not coming from privileged background in the status quo. We think this is the implication of this is that by nature, the art on our side of the house is the way more easier to interpret for the people on the ground, for the reason that the people creating those arts are coming from the same background. The second thing I'm going to pose here is who creates discourse on the other side of the house, because we think what counts more is not necessarily the nature of art, but rather the discourse surrounding art itself. We think here there are two reasons why the discourse surrounding cryptic art is the way more inclusive to the one that's surrounding traditional art, explicit art that OG that government protects. The first thing here is that it is an emerging, rising trend in the status quo to draw and like to like exhibit like cryptic art, which means that there is no like existing demographic that they can rely on, which means that they need to cater to the new demographics that are not like that used to be not interested in art, that are not familiar with art from the get-go. We think there is a strong commercial incentive on the creator side, on the museum side, on the like film creator side, on our side of the house to speak to the people who used to not watch art. That is why they're likely to have incentive to, like, for example, put simple ads or simple explanation that's like easy to understand for any people from any demographic in multiple languages, for example, in order to integrate those people as consumers. But the second thing to note here is that like they're likely to be posted on social media, or active discussion is likely to go on social media, which is particularly appealing to the younger generation. That is because like if you, for example, even if you put a beautiful painting on Instagram, like probably like not many people react, and it's because it's just beautiful, but rather like if you put, for example, a question about how to interpret like behaviors of neometrics, that's going to probably like evoke discussion on like that provoke like many interpretation coming from multiple friends of you, which means that the casual marketing is likely to be more prevalent on the other side of the house, given that people have more incentive to talk about those things on the social media. That's completely different on the other side of the house, when the discourse of the people, the platform that surround those like traditional art are pretty notorious for being elitistic and for being like feudal. That is why like if you as an average person accidentally going to those like traditional museums or traditional community that talks about those traditional art and says something irrelevant, you are probably like labeled as someone that's like ignorant. That's why like you don't like to be the part of the community in the first place, even if you do like the art on the other side of the house. But the final thing to pose here is how people perceive those messages.
Right.
We think importantly that people are more likely to find their favorite artists or favorite art on their side of the house, find art on our side of the house, for the reason that traditional art apparently seems to be like pretty similar, like even if they are actually different, like it appears pretty similar to an average person. We think it's the way easier on our side of the house to find an artist that's favorite of yourself, which like recruits more people on their side. I take you or he.
So this is all still incredibly uncomparative. And the reason why is because the methods by which we're able to extend skills training for art has largely increased in status quo. And oftentimes it's minority people who can't afford to take the hit of potentially bombing and therefore allow it to become better in the comparative. So they have to create types of art.
We think like even if it's like relatively rising compared to the past, it's still like relatively difficult for the underprivileged people to attain the technique required in the art that government tries to support. We think our analysis about how people perceive, which is to say like finding your favorite artist is crucial, given that it's more probably intrinsic than like an opening oppositions analysis, that like it's going to be less difficult for people to obtain, because like even if it's less difficult to obtain, that doesn't prove that people are going to obtain. There are like numerous things in the world that are easy for me to obtain, but I do not opt into the majority of those things because I'm not interested in them. That is why like my proof that like, the people are going to be able to find their favorite artists, given that like there are a myriad number of like completely different artists on our side of the house to post different types of art. We think it's the way more contributing analysis to prove that like people are willing to opt into the market of those arts from the get-go. When here is that firstly, it's more centration in the debate. That's why we are taking this debate first. Secondly, we think it's more impactful than the authoritarian movement argument coming from all, because to which like comparative is quite not intuitive. CEO.
Thank the member of opposition for the speech. To conclude the debate for government as a whole, go for it.
Okay. Sorry, there's
Can we type? Maybe we can try turning on the camera.
Let's see.
I fixed the.
Okay. Okay. I will read the motion and let me know if it's okay. This house opposes cryptic art.
Yes,
okay.
clear.
Oh, please. Okay. Where's my phone? Perfect. POS through chat, please. Every other team in this debate gets the debate wrong. It is not about whether or not we can get people to access meaning in looking at art. Because let's be frank, just because an artist says that they mean for something to express this message doesn't stop individuals from finding their own meaning, doesn't stop them from, for example, talking to their parents or their relatives or their friends about how that art has affected them. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, the vast majority of individuals who consume art will not be policed by the rich, will not be policed by people like the artists who can decide on the meaning, because oftentimes they don't end up in those spaces in the first place. Therefore, this debate is about whether or not the average person can, one, value art and therefore just believe that anything that comes out of it that the rest of this debate relies on, like meaning making, is something that can actually be derived. But secondly, and more importantly, whether or not the people who would probably end up in this industry anyway, therefore be taken seriously by the people around them. And it's only in CG where we explain that with cryptic art, that is not the case. I want to first kill CO, easiest team to kill. One, when they explain that new facets of art will be created to cater to new areas, I think one, they don't explain why the release of this kind of art is likely to reach the intended audiences. Oftentimes, especially if it is cryptic, it is unclear whether or not algorithms, for example, will be tailored to meet these intended audiences. If it is true that art is what you make of it, and the meaning therefore is not very clear, it is unclear then how that reaches other people. But second, we would suggest that oftentimes this is actually a flip case, where the vast majority of times where you rely on cryptic art is where it is dominated by rich and white people, because if they cannot attach to elements of the art, they will attach to things like name, like reputation, which is why you see a lot of the examples we throw out being, for example, Picasso, being, for example, Marcel Duchamp, which oftentimes already explains why specifically it is incredibly difficult to believe that art becomes more accessible or more accessible forms of art are created. But finally, I would suggest that even if it is about minorities, that still falls to our benefits, insofar as people who opt into this art, like this art fields, etc., tend to also be extremely vulnerable to the point at which they typically are, for example, starving artists with no real support around society because they believe that this art form or that this way of life is meaningless. First then, so CO is clearly dead, but let's talk about OO. And I want to beat OO on their main priority of expression and relatable art. One, the definition of cryptic art is probably what the artist intends, but does not mean that individuals are confined to derive personal meaning from cryptic art alone. And I want to illustrate this with a very clear example. Art that, for example, depicts the passion and death of Jesus Christ is clear and intentioned in explaining a very specific storyline. But by its metrics, they are a product of time. Like there's no such thing as crucifixion today, and you probably will not have the fear of literal crucifixion. But the reason that this art still exists and is even mimicked today is because people can still attach meaning to it. That, for example, the poor and minorities experience modern day crucifixion in the way in which society fails them, in the way in which society leads them to suffer at their own or to preserve their own values. And what this therefore suggests is perhaps it is a product of its own time, but it is not true that these kinds of themes are not culturally relevant, are not things you can therefore find meaning in. And that's precisely why you just cannot believe that this argument is something that is exclusive to their side, because the suffering has evolved, but the essence of it remains the same, and people can still attach themselves to it because honestly, if the artist is dead, nothing can stop them. And what this illustrates is that there's still meaning making in directed forms of art, because people can still find meaning in things without other people having to police it because they can keep it to themselves. So again, this cannot be debate winning. That part is dead. But they try to save this by saying that you get interference from the rich. One, it is unclear why intellectualization is a real impact in this debate, because if you believe the framework of their second argument, where the rich and the where you have people in power trying to control those who are not as powerful, I am unsure why the discourse of the two would coexist in the same space. And I'd flip this and say it's far worse on their side, insofar as when galleries, for example, cannot leverage meaning as a storyline for a curated exhibit, that is where they have to leverage things that are more inaccessible but evidently present. Things like technique, things like, for example, the stroke of Picasso's pen, which honestly, the vast majority of people will not give a shit about. It's quite simple. Silencing their voices is a non-issue in this debate, especially since LO's first response to OG is to frame that this is a world with social media, which means shutting down discussions are not effective insofar as they agree that it's a democratized world. Thirdly, if art is what you make of it, it's much easier, therefore, to brush off art of minorities aside, because if they still assume that people are rich people can control narratives and probably control things like media, then it's unclear, therefore, why they would allow certain forms of expression with regard to cryptic art to still exist if you believe that they prove the incentive that rich people will control them. So how therefore does our extension beat them? I think one, on expression, people can project meaning onto anything, and therefore what matters more is whether or not artists can properly express themselves without active resistance from society, without active resistance from the people around them, which Sams explains is what actively stops them from being able to find meaning in the first place. But secondly, on censorship, we would suggest that authoritarian regimes are not the margin of the debate. At no point do they explain why art is a tipping point for any kind of change. And again, note that catharsis can be met if you cannot express fully. And what this therefore means is, it is on their world where it's not just censorship of those in authoritarian regimes, but all of the artists who want to be artists, who want to opt into this life and therefore express how they feel, and are stopped because they are told it is invaluable. Before I go on to see OG, go ahead.
So this debate is about extents. If people can still derive meaning from normal art on your world, what we specifically argue in OO is that it happens to a greater extent when there are less guardrails to art.
Yeah, but this extent is very marginal insofar as you guys don't prove why people are unable to think independently when they see a piece of art. Let's kill OG then. They try to say that it's about accessibility. I want to point out they rely on knowledge being a requisite of interpreting symbols. That's just not true. People who aren't traditionally educated can still find art and meaning. That's why we see a lot of art for indigenous people, etc. Second, it's a value neutral analysis insofar as you could probably argue limited accessibility on either world. But what therefore changes in our world is we explain why it is far easier for an individual to opt into art as a field or believe and be invested in the field because they are not told that it is meaningless or useless. Finally then, why is Sam's extension debate winning? One, we are logically prior. All teams assume a free market of art in which there will always be many art pieces you can pick and choose to find meaning in. Insofar as cryptic art leads to less valuation, you have on net less people who will become artists, less people who want to push those kinds of things out, and therefore you limit the extent of meaning making on OO. But finally, we protect a clearly more vulnerable actor. Those who are starving artists, who dedicated their entire life to this field, but are told that their lives have been wasted because they did not choose a better life that is supposedly more valuable and more skillful.
All right, thank the Gov Whip for that speech. To conclude this debate in its entirety, Opposition Whip.
Okay, hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So, POI is exclusively on chat, please. Okay, so starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 comparisons. Firstly, starting from the opening government, next closing government, finally talking about opening opposition. But before that, a simple clarification. I think all the other teams in this debate just asserted that art is only about, for example, paintings exhibited in the museum. But I think this is I think when they only limit this debate to this context, they usually lack impacting, because obviously people do not obviously people do not go to like museums that often in the first place. I think by limiting this context, I think all of the teams only have a limited impact. As my partner already told you, this also includes like musics, which can be easily accessed by many people on YouTube, whatever. I think this is an important clarification to talk about. I think the meaningless exchange on like whether those poor people can afford going to museums or not is largely irrelevant to this debate in the first place. Moving on to comparison with opening government, let me just look at. I think the largest problem of today's opening government claim is that they try to explain like how difficult the understanding of those cryptic odds is difficult, but I think they failed to show, and they lack comparative to explain that why their side is far better. But I think note that O's response neither is very insufficient insufficient to beat the OG's premise. I think opening opposition explains that all in the counterfactual required to be intellectual to understand. But I think this is only an assertion, because given that the OG's nuance was that there will be more widespread of simple odds which can be easily understood by many kind of individuals, I think the O's analysis doesn't necessarily clash with the OG's characterization. O is correct in a way that they explain that reaching to the so-called correct interpretation will be valued in their side of the house, in the government paradigm, but they fail to show whether it is actually difficult for the people to reach that kind of interpretation. Given the OG's nuance, I think they did not correctly engage to the nuance. Given that, I'd like to make two responses to the OG's claim. Firstly, I think that delta is really a bit unclear in the OG's argument. So if they claim that there's a high demand from the underprivileged people, to say that there will be coming from for demand for like very simple arts which many people can understand, I think people will demand for art which can be emphasized by those people. I think it is unclear to me why these arts are likely to disappear in our side of the house. But rather, I think it will anyway exist, since there is a continuous demand existing from those people. But secondly, and more crucially, I think the OG asserted that there will be like simple arts rising in the absence of those cryptic arts. But I think those kind of arts are not the likely form which will emerge in the absence of cryptic arts. I have two reasons for this. Firstly, like at the incentive of artists, obviously they don't want to create things which everyone else can. For example, like a very simple drawing which like elementary school student can even also create or whatever. I think this is for the exact reason why they become artists. Obviously, they wanted to become outstanding in the field of painting, in the field of like creating lyrics or whatever. I do not think that this is the typical art which is likely to spread in this type of house. But secondly, I think as for the commercial incentives of the artists, obviously they need to be funded. They need to be funded by people. They need to they need to be purchased by many people in order to sustain the wealth. I think those kind of simple arts will not be consumed by people or will not be exhibited in the museum in the first place. I think to make it, because like you can see that anywhere, like you can see even in schools, like if it is very simple. I think to make difference from other artists, like those people will try to use difficult techniques, which is only understandable for the privileged people, or they are likely to use like difficult motifs, which match to the art, and which is largely inaccessible due to the educational gap between those people. I think the conclusion here is that I think it is worse. It is worse in the government side of the house, because when people see those like difficult and complicated arts, they will be excluded from the discourse. As my partner clearly pointed out, I think these people will be seen as very people who lack knowledge, people who are idiots in the discussion of the arts. I think these are very exclusive, very not uninclusive discussion of arts. The unique delta in our side of the house is that since those cryptic arts tend to be inclusive in nature, and as my partner already told you, people people are likely to opt into those arts for the specific reason my partner claimed. I think this is the most important delta in this debate to claim. So we override opening government, but before that, OG BY.
Yes, artists have an incentive to specialize their art because it is a blue ocean. So minority can find suitable art in Elizabeth's house. But when art becomes cryptic art, it's the interpretation are dominated and shaped by the majority. So it's hard for the minority to believe into their own interpretation in Elizabeth's house.
That characterization is not likely because obviously those cryptic arts are more inclusive to many people due to the nature that, as my opponent already also claimed, cryptic artists also try to like make their arts more inclusive as possible. I think your side is far more inaccessible because they require more knowledge, more education. Moving to the engagement to the closing government, I think the large chunk of claim coming from the closing government is that they say that privileged people will dominate the attention economy, so forth. I largely have two claims. Firstly, I think in order to be evaluated in the traditional metric of art, they need knowledge, they need expertise. I think it's far more inaccessible for the minority artists in their side of the house. This looks like, for example, going to the art universities or like going through years of training under a famous artist. I think this can be only accessible for the privileged individuals in society who have wealth, who have personal connections. I think their side of the art creation is far more inaccessible for the minorities. But secondly, I think cryptic art is more inclusive in nature from the, for example, from the creative perspective. Like they do not require like certain like specific types of skills or specific type of techniques, or like they can use their full imagination and create that kind of art that does not require to be like to follow the specific standards or whatever. I think this uniquely opens up the possibility for the minority artists to enter the market, which is inaccessible in this subject. Moving to the claim on like whether it's cryptic art crowding out everything. I think that is not very that is unlikely in the first place. Obviously, people prefer different types of art. Not all people prefer that type of art. I think they, in order to make difference between, for example, other museums or whatever, they will exhibit different types of art in the first place. But also, I think they talked about the worsened perception of art, but I think I didn't understand what is the problem of that. I think, as my partner claimed, the most proximate impact in this debate is talking about whether these people can actually access to are able to access to the message of arts. Proud to oppose.
Call goes as follows. This is a short diagonal win with, on quite a close margin, opening opposition getting the first, closing government getting the second, closing opposition getting the third, opening government getting the fourth. I won't be giving general feedback because I think you can just ask me personal feedback. I probably have a lot more extensive thoughts there. If I give general feedback, this will be a bit longer. We will go in chronological order, starting with the top half debate and explaining why opening opposition wins over opening government. The broad contribution of OG is very simple. It is that cryptic art is inaccessible broadly to three mechanisms. First, that it is very hard to have knowledge on. Second is that very hard to, it requires time to understand. And third is that the vast majority of the interpretation is dominated by majority white people. So relatively speaking, very like, the discourse is not something that it's legitimate because minorities are not able to access this. So the impacting they give is that it's very hard to even access discourse from minorities. At least in the comparative, is quite simple art. Opening opposition clash with this by firstly disputing the capacity for art to be accessible by saying that it is indeed relatable because it is cryptic in nature. So you have lived different experience, etc. And because the fact that art is all about the diverse experience, and when it is cryptic, you allow the capacity of people to appreciate this more and cater towards this more. And then they try to flip the OG argument by saying that the whole harms of the majority can also happen on their side because of the fact that white people also dictate the meaning behind explicit art. So the experience of catharsis that minorities have can also be accessible because you might also need knowledge to understand that art, etc. Then they give an extension about dictatorships. Let's broadly then two reasons why I think opening opposition beat OG in this top half clash. Firstly, that the impact of catharsis on opening opposition ultimately does take a precedence, becoming the most important weighing metric in the round, and opening opposition was able to utilize that analysis to beat the whole thing about inaccessible. So how were they able to do this based on the debate that happened? Opening government case requires you to believe that minorities, or at least the vast majority of minorities, were not able to access these platforms to engage because they were either uneducated or don't have catharsis. But I think what opening opposition is able to point here, a specific hole in the OG case, was to suggest that the the art being cryptic in nature means that you were able to have that experience in relating it to your own way. And it is unclear to the extent of which opening government proved the full extent of the harm of these arts not becoming so like that inaccessible, right? Because sure, there is a potential that this art is, because of the vagueness, has a majority interpretation, but it's unclear why the harm from OG is particularly comparative in the first place, given that the vibe check here is that if it is the Mona Lisa or simplistic art dominating on your side, how will minorities get catharsis towards this? I think open government tried to have an angle here where they tried to broadly say that, hey, we do have forms of expression because they are forms of art that relate to minorities, but they don't analyze the extent of that extent of which this is going to take over and become the main form of catharsis, which is called out correctly by a leader of opposition. So in this specific comparison, I'm far more likely to believe opening opposition's metric here, because they're able to explain firstly that because the fact that this is something that is sort of easy to look into and bring your own experience, that's where you're able to get a level of catharsis. And there's not much response from DPM aside from the fact there's white majority that takes this art impacting out. But secondly, I think opening opposition is just able to beat the biggest harm of OG, which is the white majority thing, by explaining that the democratization of interpretation is likely to happen even if there is one majority interpretation, because you are still valuing the art based on your own standard, and like just generally speaking, this is something that you're able to sort of express that emotion overall. So TLDR, even if we believe OG analysis extent of analysis in proving that this art might be inaccessible, they first really aren't able to prove the extent of which this is so particularly damaging that it overtakes the broad perception of art. Opening opposition is able to explain that the ways that people think and perceive art likely does not get taken out by this broad inaccessibility point. They are still able to relate to it, but even if that was a problem, the broad democratization of art, etc., means to suggest that it's probably not going to be that bad. Unclear. It's just not really fully clear on the extent of which OG proves that this art is so wholly inaccessible. Now we bring in closing government. Closing government brings two strategic extensions. First, on proving that cryptic art will likely devalue the art scene as a whole, and this is the most important in terms of artists being screwed over, because cryptic art takes the overall makes the perception of art seems sort of vague. And the second broad line of strategy that closing government do is mostly on the responsive end by trying to wash out the benefit of expression and catharsis by suggesting that the comparative of other arts existing can also exist in terms of this can also give catharsis to people. So there is direct representation of this art happening. I want to first do the gov bench weighing here. I think what closing government is able to do in terms of opening government a bit better is directly engage with the metric of catharsis a bit better. Because the hole in the opening government case, as of it now, is that they rely on knowledge and things like external factors making art inaccessible, but they're not able to specifically prove this burden to the fullest extent. I think closing government fulfills a different analytical burden, which is slightly bit better. That's to say that they prove that the counterfactual is a world in which you still are able to get some degree of catharsis, for the reason that the intellectualization cannot really harm others because art is still relatively democratized. Like, people cannot police art, but there's also art that exists to sort of cater to these people. But I think the second way that closing government is able to win against OG is on bringing a new stakeholder, which is the idea of vulnerable artists. And he suggests that because there is a risk of cryptic art making the broad perception of art to the general populace something seen as a joke, I think what they're able to sort of do here is suggest a different delta that has more likelihood of happening compared to open government, or at least it does not have much barriers compared to open government case. So the broad weighing there is OG and CG have different vulnerable stakeholders. OG could have one of their stakeholders, but the extent of which they prove that the stakeholder is being harmed or why they prove the counterfactual where it's not extensively clear on their side, CG is able to take a broadly different horizontal strategy of how this affects the art world. On a whole, I think this wins on the extent of scale that they're able to operate in harming the art sphere as a whole, insofar as that discourse that might happen is probably not going to exist and it is broadly largely a bigger thing. Now we deal with the short diagonal comparison. I think to just observe, CG's extension is one of those things where if it really did meet its burden, it would definitely have taken the first. So leads really nicely into the reason why I did not believe, even though I do think it was close, CG was not able to take it against OO. So the main positive extension we get on the idea of this might make the art gallery take seriously, I don't think it broadly is able to contend in win against the OO case as much as the intention of the CG case does. So I get the broad idea of making it proving that people might take this seriously, but if we relate it to OO, what was needed to be applied within this extension was to prove why specifically the extent of people taking this as a joke was so large that it completely inhibited the ability for any of OO's positive benefits to manifest. So after hearing the extension off the top of the bat, the question I was asking here was, even if it is true that cryptic art probably conflates the value of art and has that related, and even if Gov Whip call out is correct that the people at OO is talking about will relate to art in different ways, the question I have here is that just explains that OO's positive benefits is not exclusive, but it doesn't necessarily explain why their benefits are taken down. So the POI that that OO brings to GovWhip here is important, where if it is not comparative, when it is happening on both sides, the extent is still important. So I guess there are two things to note here. First is the extent of the harm of art from CG enough? And secondly, are they able to prove that the extent of OO benefit is marginal? I think on the first thing, it's just again, it's just broadly still not clear. Even if I believe the best case of the CG case, why this is such overly encompassing, nor does it explain why OO's case is particularly less persuasive in its nature, like why they don't reach their impacts. Because even if it's true that that's like cryptic art is taken less seriously, it's unclear why it's every single form of cryptic art, even if the two mechanisms given describe broadly what cryptic art looks like. But secondly, it just doesn't explain why people won't bother try relating to this, because they still need to sort of have that catharsis. So yes, possibly it's true that you reduce detail and that reduces the experience to art, which may deal with the OO mechanism, but it's unclear how the application of these mechanisms apply to most cryptic art in the first place. I think in this instance, opening opposition case still sort of takes a precedence because they're still able to prove that. But on the second thing, which GovWhip questions, what is the actual margin of a benefit that OO has if on both worlds minorities can broadly get that experience? I still think it is enough, because opening opposition is able to say that if we look at the comparative, even if it is true that other forms of art could possibly be accessible, I think what opening opposition is able to explain here is that there's still certain kinds of pieces of art, specifically cryptic art, that are not something that you can intellectualize that to lock out minorities. So it is still something that the most important people can access, specifically minorities. So I think what closing a government isn't really able to prove here is that even if it is true that on the other side of the world you are able to sort of have that relatability with direct art, it is unclear why this is the most better form of art. Like, it's unclear why that becomes the biggest reason to oppose cryptic art in the vast majority of cases. Opening opposition's case is still standing. I think closing government do directly take down the dictatorship point. I just don't really think opening opposition was able to win on that point alone. So broadly speaking, on that short diagonal comparison, I will agree it's close, because closing government does a lot of work in trying to prove that within the metric of artists, if like but again, within the metric of artists and broadly making the art seem as a joke, that may screw over all the OO impact. But because they're not able to prove the extent of which this harms the art sphere and therefore harms artists and harms the perception, OO's impact still left standing. So, and even if CG tried to do good responses to prove that it's marginal, it's unclear why this takes on the full extent of the OO benefit, because they don't prove how the other aspects of art is something that can really get that relatability in the first place. Let's now get to closing opposition. Closing opposition tried to run a vertical on explaining the prerequisite burden of accessibility. They say that people, people who create this art have to relate to like the general populace, and when they create discourse, all of these things happen. And this is something that's quite easier to be perceived. Why does closing opposition still lose to opening opposition? Even if closing opposition has some fair call out on specific burdens OO miss, which is that opening opposition don't specifically prove where this art comes from and where the discourse come from, the analysis they actually try to give to fill this burden is not really enough to sort of hijack OO completely. Because even if I did not take the CO burden enough and I look at the OO case as it is, the analysis to give is on specifically how people experience and relate towards art as it exists, especially when it is cryptic in nature. So closing opposition broadly needed to do a lot of work to sort of explain why the mechanisms they're giving is enough of a prerequisite to access these benefits. So sure, they explain that people who create this art are from the same field of minorities, but it's just like, but why is this sort of the exclusive prerequisite mechanism for OO to access their impact? And also in the question of the idea of creating discourse, I am just unclear to the extent of which this is also a premise in their case that becomes a tipping point to win the op bench comparison in the first place. Because the whole point of closing opposition impacting of the idea of people being able to relate to this is that you were able to access discourse in the first place. You were able to make this art meaningful to other people. So it's unclear to the extent of which closing opposition becomes the prerequisite theme here. So the weighing that closing opposition tries to apply here is we feel specific burdens missing in OO, but on first glance, it seems that OO sort of already implicitly takes those burdens because the analysis on people does sort of relate to things like discourse, and OO is not really needing to rely on the way that this art is created in order to prove they're impacting. So closing opposition needed to do a lot more work specifically on their extension in trying to prove why is it that people do this. On COCG, I think closing opposition reason why they lose here is that they don't really do a lot of like good direct rebuttal against closing government. I think the only real rebuttal we get is privileged people dominate and cryptic people clouds out everything. I think the way that CG is able to win against CO here is because closing government specifically explains against CO that it's very hard to create new facets of art. And how it's very hard to sort of have this art be accessible when it comes to cryptic art, but also on the broad general idea of how people will not take this seriously. I think that's the main broad winning extension on CG that CO don't really try to deal or engage with. So on that note, on the lack of engagement, I'm far more willing to believe CG's extension take priority here because it directly harms the impact of discourse and harms the impact of getting more art, given that they are somewhat able to prove that people aren't able to take this seriously to the fullest extent. So even though opening opposition preemptively is able to insulate themselves from this, closing opposition does not do the work to uniquely insulate themselves from this harm. Therefore, I don't think CO beats CG. Why does CO beat OG? So CO do respond to OG quite a lot, and I think in the relation to closing opposition and opening government, given that opening government was not really able to prove a the full extent of their harms of being not educated, but also closing opposition is able to explain that there is broad continuous demand created by virtue of them proving the extension of where this art comes from. They are first able to prove the incentive to make sure that this cryptic art is something that is relatable towards people in the first place, given that if it wasn't, then it would just not feel in the specific point in the first place. But secondly, they explain the kinds of discourse that does happen wants to be catering towards minorities. I think opening government is not really able to preempt this because their frame relies on believing that cryptic art was only something that was elitist without engaging with the instance of the kinds of cryptic art that could be accessible towards general minorities. So OG's case operates on a frame which is quite narrow in scope. Closing opposition breaks that scope by explaining that it's not just about that, and the creation of this suggests that it's probably not going to be in that specific instance. That's all for the OA. Thank you, everyone. Again, if you want feedback, just contact me on Discord. I will see. Good luck for round 2.
Thanks for the OA, Imran. We'll message you. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks so much.
Anytime. See you guys.
Thank you.